I moved into the lake house on a quiet Tuesday morning, the kind of day that feels deliberately calm, like the world is holding its breath. The moving truck pulled away, leaving behind tire marks on the gravel and a silence so deep I could hear the water lapping against the shoreline. The lake stretched wide and glassy in front of me, docks extending into it like orderly fingers. It felt peaceful. Earned.
Mine.
I had just finished unloading the last box when I noticed the first car slow down. Then another. By noon, 3 vehicles were parked awkwardly along the road near my driveway. Doors opened. Voices rose. And without so much as a knock, a group of people marched straight toward my front porch with the confidence of trespassers who thought they were in charge. At the center was her.
Karen.
Late 40s, clipboard tucked under her arm, sunglasses pushed up into her hair like a crown. She didn't look curious or cautious. She looked annoyed, offended, as if my existence on this property was a personal inconvenience. "I'm the HOA president," she announced before I could even say hello. "We need to talk about the lake." I blinked.
Once.
Slowly. "I just moved in," I said. "Is there a problem?" "Yes," she snapped, tapping her clipboard. "You can't restrict access to community water. That lake is shared, and we've already had complaints." I glanced past her at the water. The docks. The clearly marked shoreline. Everything exactly as it had been when I signed the deed. "I haven't restricted anything," I replied. "I haven't done anything at all." Karen scoffed. "That's not what matters. This HOA has controlled lake access for over 20 years. You don't get to just move in and change things." That was my first red flag. The word controlled. I asked her which HOA she was referring to. She rattled off the name of a lakeside development half a mile down the road. Nice houses. Neatly trimmed lawns. Zero jurisdiction over my land. "I'm not part of your HOA," I said calmly. She smiled like she'd been waiting for that. "Oh, you will be." Behind her, a few homeowners nodded in agreement, arms crossed, already convinced I was the problem. Karen stepped closer, lowering her voice like she was doing me a favor. "The docks you see out there," she continued, "those are for community use. You don't get to tell people where they can and can't park their boats." That's when I realized what this was really about. The docks. They weren't just near my property. They were on my property. Every plank, every piling, every access point, clearly outlined in the survey I'd reviewed a dozen times before closing. The previous owner had allowed informal use years ago. Karen had mistaken permission for ownership. I told her that.
Gently.
Directly. Her smile vanished. "That's not correct," she said sharply. "We have documents." "I have the deed," I replied. She flipped her clipboard around, waving a blurry map in my face. "This shows shared access." I shook my head. "It doesn't." Her voice rose instantly. "You can't just cut people off. Families have been using those docks for years." "I haven't cut anyone off," I repeated. "But they aren't community docks." That's when Karen did something that made the air change. She pointed at the lake and said, loud enough for everyone to hear, "If you try to stop us, we'll make your life very difficult." The lake was still, the sky clear, and standing on my own porch, surrounded by strangers demanding property they didn't own, I understood one thing with absolute clarity. They thought I was bluffing. They had no idea what I actually controlled. Karen didn't wait for my response. She turned back to her group like a general addressing troops, already convinced she'd won. "We'll give him some time to think it over," she announced, loud and performative. "In the meantime, nothing changes. People keep using the docks as usual." I watched them walk away, confidence radiating off every step. They weren't angry yet. They were comfortable. And that, I knew, was dangerous. By the next morning, the docks were busier than I'd ever seen them. Boats lined up along the pilings. Coolers stacked on planks. Kids running back and forth like it was a public marina. Karen had spread the word fast, framing it as a power move, proof that the HOA didn't bow to outsiders. I stepped outside with my coffee and took it all in. The noise. The entitlement. The way people acted like my shoreline was a park they'd always owned. I didn't yell. I didn't threaten. I didn't even walk down to the water. Instead, I made a phone call. The docks weren't just wood and water. They were regulated infrastructure tied to permits, insurance riders, and maintenance contracts. The previous owner had been lax about enforcement, but the legal framework was still there, attached to me now. By noon, the Marina Service Company arrived. 2 trucks. 1 boat. A crew in reflective vests who moved with professional calm. Karen noticed immediately. She marched down the path, clipboard back in hand, already shouting before she reached the dock. "You can't be here," she snapped. "This is community property." The crew lead didn't argue. He handed her a laminated permit and pointed to the name printed clearly at the top.
Mine.
"These docks are under private control," he said. "We're here for compliance adjustments." Karen turned to me, eyes blazing. "You did this on purpose." "I told you yesterday," I replied. "You didn't listen." The crew began their work. Signs went up, clear, legal, unmistakable. Private dock. Authorized use only. Access gates were secured. Mooring rights temporarily suspended pending reassignment. It wasn't dramatic. It was procedural. And it drove Karen insane. She started calling people. Board members. Lawyers. Anyone who would answer. Her voice carried across the water, shrill and frantic. By mid-afternoon, the docks were empty. People left quietly, some confused, some angry, but none willing to argue with posted permits and uniformed professionals. The lake fell silent again, ripples fading as the last boat pulled away. Karen wasn't done. She stormed back up the path toward my house, red-faced, waving her phone. "You're violating community rights," she yelled. "This HOA will fine you into the ground." I met her at the edge of my property line. "You can't fine someone who isn't a member," I said. "And you can't claim docks you don't own." She laughed, sharp and brittle. "We'll see." That evening, I received the first notice. A fake violation. Then another. Then another. Printed letters slipped into my mailbox like threats disguised as paperwork. I didn't respond. Instead, I forwarded every single one to my attorney. 2 days later, Karen escalated again. She scheduled an emergency HOA meeting and invited local officials, framing the situation as a hostile takeover of community assets. Her confidence was back, but thinner now, stretched over a foundation that was starting to crack. She thought pressure would make me fold. She didn't realize the docks weren't my leverage. They were just the beginning. The emergency HOA meeting was held at the Lakeside Clubhouse, a glass-fronted building designed to impress people who liked the illusion of authority. I didn't attend. I didn't need to. By then, Karen had already made her next mistake. She'd invited the wrong kind of attention. Instead of local officials showing up to back her claims, representatives from the County Water Authority arrived first. Then a zoning compliance officer. Then someone from shoreline management. Karen had expected applause. What she got was scrutiny. I found out later that she opened the meeting with a slideshow.
Maps.
Old photos. Anecdotes about shared tradition. She spoke confidently, fast, trying to overwhelm questions with volume. It worked until it didn't. A zoning officer asked her a simple question. "Who owns the docks?" Karen deflected. She talked about historical use, verbal agreements, community expectation. The officer asked again. "Who owns them?" Silence. When she finally admitted the docks sat on my deeded shoreline, the room shifted. Authority doesn't like surprises, and it really doesn't like being misled. By the next morning, the pressure turned sideways, onto her. I received a call from the County Water Authority asking for documentation. I sent everything within an hour. Deed, survey, permits, maintenance records.
Clean. Clear.
Undeniable. That afternoon, notices went out, not to me but to the HOA. Unauthorized use. Improper representation of control. Failure to disclose private ownership. Each violation came with language that made lawyers nervous. Karen tried to regain control by going public. She posted in community forums claiming I was privatizing the lake and cutting off families. The posts gained traction until people started asking questions she couldn't answer. Screenshots of the survey circulated. Someone shared the permit photo from the dock signage. Her narrative collapsed in real time. That evening, two unfamiliar trucks parked near the clubhouse. Contractors. Not dock workers, inspectors. They walked the shoreline, measuring, photographing, taking notes. Karen followed them like a shadow, gesturing wildly. I stayed home and watched from my porch. The next escalation came fast. Karen showed up at my door with a printed packet and a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Let's be reasonable," she said. "We can draft a shared use agreement." I declined. Her voice hardened. "Then we'll challenge your ownership." I nodded. "Go ahead."
She did.
Within days, the HOA filed a formal dispute claiming implied easement and adverse use. It sounded intimidating. It wasn't. The legal standard was high, and their evidence was thin. My attorney responded with a single motion and a request for sanctions. That's when Karen panicked. Emails leaked. Board members distanced themselves. One resigned outright, citing concerns about personal liability. Another demanded the HOA's insurer review coverage for board actions. The phrase, outside scope of authority, appeared again and again. Meanwhile, the docks sat quiet. No boats. No crowds. Just water and wood, finally treated as what they were, private property. A week later, I received an unexpected call from Shoreline Management. "Who told them they could use your docks?" the woman asked. I smiled. That's the question, isn't it? Karen had spent years acting like permission never expired. Now she was learning the difference between tradition and trespass. And she still hadn't realized how much trouble she was in. Karen's world started shrinking fast. The legal dispute she'd filed didn't intimidate anyone. It exposed her. Once the county and shoreline authorities began coordinating, every move she'd made over the past several years came under a microscope. What she thought was a pressure tactic turned into a spotlight. The first crack appeared inside the HOA itself. Board members who had once nodded along suddenly wanted distance. Emails surfaced asking who had authorized Karen to claim control over private docks. Meeting minutes were reviewed. Votes were re-examined. The uncomfortable truth emerged quickly. Most of the board had never formally approved anything she'd done. They had simply let her run with it. And now they were scared. I received copies of internal HOA messages from a neighbor who'd had enough. Karen was demanding loyalty, accusing people of betrayal, insisting the HOA had to stand firm or lose everything. But fear doesn't inspire confidence, it exposes desperation. Then came the letter from the HOA's insurance provider. They were reserving rights. That phrase carries weight. It meant coverage might not apply if board members acted outside their authority. Personal liability was suddenly on the table, and Karen's name appeared repeatedly in the documentation. Enforcement actions.
Threats.
Claims of ownership she couldn't legally support. The tone changed overnight. I was asked politely this time if I'd consider a mediated resolution. Not shared use. Not control. Just peace. The same people who had stormed my porch days earlier now wanted compromise. I declined again. Not out of spite, but because compromise requires honesty, and they were only just learning how much damage had already been done. Karen tried one last maneuver. She scheduled a dock access demonstration, encouraging residents to show solidarity by gathering near the shoreline. It backfired spectacularly. County officials were already present, clipboards in hand. The gathering dispersed quietly once people realized this wasn't a protest. It was potential evidence. Karen didn't show up. Instead, a notice was delivered to her home that afternoon. A formal cease and desist regarding representations of ownership and enforcement beyond HOA jurisdiction. It wasn't dramatic. It didn't threaten jail. It simply told her, in unmistakable language, to stop. She didn't. 2 days later, the state got involved. I learned about it the same way everyone else did, through whispers and half-confirmed messages. Karen had been interviewed. Not accused. Interviewed. Her statements conflicted with records. Her claims didn't align with filings. The story she'd told for years began collapsing under basic verification. That's when the board made their move. Karen was suspended pending investigation. Her access to HOA communications was revoked. Her authority stripped quietly, without ceremony. No announcement. No apology. Just removal. I saw her drive past the property once that week. Slower than before. No clipboard. No entourage. Just a glance toward the docks she no longer controlled, then eyes forward again. The docks remained locked. Legal. Quiet. A revised notice arrived from the county confirming what I already knew. My ownership and control were valid, documented, and enforceable. Any further interference would be treated as intentional trespass. The lake, indifferent as ever, reflected the sky without comment. Karen had spent years believing momentum was power, that if she moved fast enough, loudly enough, no one would stop to question her. But authority doesn't come from repetition. It comes from legitimacy. And once legitimacy is challenged, it doesn't matter how long someone's been pretending. Their grip slips. Sometimes, all at once. By the time everything settled, the lake felt different, not because anything physical had changed, but because the tension was gone. The water moved the same way it always had, slow and steady against the shoreline, but now there was no sense of waiting for the next confrontation. The silence wasn't fragile anymore. It was real. The HOA issued a final notice to residents explaining the outcome in careful, legal language. No names. No blame. Just a clear acknowledgement that the docks were privately owned and that any previous assumptions of community control were incorrect. Access rules were updated. Enforcement boundaries were clarified. The message was obvious to anyone who read between the lines. Karen was finished. She didn't resign publicly. There was no dramatic exit or apology tour. She simply stopped appearing. Her name vanished from emails, from meeting agendas, from every document where it had once been stamped in bold authority. Power, once removed, has a way of erasing itself. Neighbors began treating the shoreline differently. Boats stayed clear. Conversations softened. A few people waved from a distance, unsure whether to apologize or pretend nothing had happened. I didn't push either way. The lake didn't need reconciliation. It needed respect. One afternoon, a couple approached me while I was repairing a loose plank near the dock. They thanked me, not for blocking access, but for forcing clarity. They admitted they'd always been uneasy about how things were handled, but didn't think anyone could challenge it. All it took was one person saying no, the man said quietly. That stuck with me. I never wanted control over anyone else. I wanted boundaries acknowledged, ownership respected. The docks weren't leverage or punishment. They were proof. Proof that permission isn't permanent, tradition isn't law, and confidence doesn't equal authority. Weeks passed. Summer settled in. The lake became what it should have been from the start, a place for water, weather, and time, not entitlement. I saw Karen once more near the entrance to the development. She looked smaller than I remembered. Not defeated, just ordinary. She didn't look at me.
She didn't need to.
The chapter was closed without either of us saying a word. The county followed up with one final confirmation. Any future claims by the HOA over my shoreline or docks would trigger immediate enforcement action. No warnings. No mediation. That clarity was worth everything. Standing on the dock at sunset, watching light scatter across the water, I thought about how quickly things unravel when someone mistakes access for ownership. Karen had relied on momentum and intimidation. What she ran into was patience, paperwork, and the quiet weight of the law. I didn't win because I shouted louder. I won because I was right. The lake didn't belong to the HOA. The docks didn't belong to the crowd. They belonged exactly where the deed said they did. And sometimes, that's all it takes to remind people where their authority ends.